Hey guys, tonight we begin with a handful of medieval troublemakers who manage to ruin things for the rest of humanity, sometimes permanently. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. For centuries, jousting was the medieval equivalent of NASCAR. Loud, dangerous, and mainly watched by people hoping someone would die. Knights lined up on horses, lowered their lances, and charged at each other like unpaid interns competing for visibility. The crowd cheered, the trumpets blared, and the church quietly prayed. The whole thing would end before anyone important exploded. Enter King Henry II of France. Athletic, proud, and blessed with the survival instincts of a pigeon near a windmill. In 1559, he decided to celebrate his daughter's wedding the way medieval kings always celebrated things, by endangering himself in public. The plan was simple. One more joust, one more display of royal masculinity, and maybe a few flattering portraits afterward. Everyone told him not to. His doctors warned him. His wife begged him. And Nostradamus, the actual Nostradamus, had literally written a prophecy predicting Henry would die in a duel with a splinter through the eye. Which, in fairness, is about as subtle as a cosmic sticky note saying, "Don't joust." But Henry wasn't one to take advice. He was a king. He'd survived wars, revolts, and French cuisine. What could possibly go wrong? He picked his opponent, Gabriel de Montgomery, the captain of his guard, and crucially a man whose job description was, "Keep the king alive." So naturally, the king challenged him to a deadly sport with pointed sticks. The first 2 rounds went fine. Cheers, applause, 0 fatalities. Then came the third pass. Montgomery's lance struck Henry square in the head, splintering on impact. One jagged piece found a gap in the king's helmet and buried itself deep in his eye socket. The crowd went silent. Someone fainted. Someone else probably tried to sell snacks. Henry was dragged away, half-conscious, but still insisting he was fine. The medieval version of it's just a scratch. 10 days later, after what historians politely call experimental medicine, he died in spectacular agony. France immediately banned jousting. Other countries followed. The era of shining armor and glorious tournaments ended not with a bang, but with one man proving that even kings shouldn't play with sharp objects. And so, thanks to one royal adrenaline junkie, Europe traded its lances for diplomacy, which ironically hurt just as much, only slower. Monks were supposed to be humble, the medieval embodiment of self-denial, silence, and regret. But even in the quietest monasteries, human stupidity found a way in. And few stories capture it better than the monk who accidentally turned self-love into arson. It began in a Benedictine monastery somewhere in 14th century France, a place where the daily schedule consisted of praying, copying manuscripts, and pretending not to hate everyone. Among the monks lived Brother Pierre, young, handsome, and apparently blessed with cheekbones sharp enough to cut parchment. Pierre had one fatal flaw. He was obsessed with his reflection. Mirrors in monasteries weren't common. Mostly polished brass or bits of metal good enough to tell you if you'd shaved or accidentally joined the heretics. But Pierre had somehow acquired one, and he used it religiously, pun intended. Every night he'd sneak into the washroom to admire himself, adjusting his tonsure like a medieval influencer prepping for divine selfies. And then came the night of the incident. Candle light, reflection, and ego, a dangerous trio. Pierre leaned closer, practicing his pious but approachable look, and somehow knocked his candle into the hay flooring. Within minutes, his vanity project turned into a 5-alarm monastery barbecue. The monks woke to chaos, smoke, shouting, and Brother Pierre running around shirtless, holding his mirror like it was a sacred relic. The abbey was half burned before dawn. The abbot, bald, furious, and smelling faintly of smoke, had seen enough of both fire and self-reflection for one lifetime. So he did what medieval leaders did best. He banned the problem. Mirrors were declared tools of vanity and forbidden in the monastery. For decades afterward, monks shaved by touch, dressed by faith, and went to confession for pride of jawline. The ban spread to other orders. Some even claimed mirrors were portals for demons, which, to be fair, was a better PR spin than Brother Pierre's bad aim. And so, because one vain monk couldn't stop flirting with himself, mirrors became sinful, monasteries got darker, and medieval Europe added another item to its long list of things we don't trust anymore. It wasn't about faith. It was about fire safety. Falconry was the medieval equivalent of owning a sports car. Expensive, flashy, and entirely useless unless you wanted everyone to know you had money. Nobles spent fortunes training hawks and falcons to swoop dramatically through the air and occasionally bring back dinner. It was elegant, prestigious, and slightly terrifying. Then came Lord Geoffrey of Kent, a man whose defining feature was confidence unaccompanied by competence. Geoffrey was determined to stand out among the noble hunters. Falcons, he decided, were overrated, too common, too mainstream. What he needed was something different, something that screamed, I am a visionary, but also, I might be an idiot. Enter the owl. Now, owls are nocturnal, solitary, and terrible at teamwork. Basically, the medieval equivalent of your coworker who refuses to use group chat. But Geoffrey, undeterred by nature, insisted his owl, Beatrice, would revolutionize falconry. He even claimed owls were smarter and more dignified than falcons, which is the kind of thing people say before history proves them wrong. During a royal hunt, Geoffrey unveiled his masterpiece. Dozens of nobles gathered, wine in hand, ready to watch this new age of birding. Geoffrey raised his arm, trumpets sounded. Beatrice blinked slowly and did absolutely nothing. Owls, after all, hunt at night. So Geoffrey did what all idiots do when reality disagrees. He doubled down. He waved his arm, shouted, and finally startled the poor bird into flight. Unfortunately, Beatrice chose the worst possible target, the royal chaplain. The owl swooped, screeched, and clawed at his tonsure like a feathery demon. Horses panicked. Someone screamed witchcraft. The king's horse bolted, and within seconds the most dignified hunting party in Europe had collapsed into medieval slapstick. The chaplain, bleeding but alive, declared the owl a servant of the devil. Geoffrey tried to defend her, but it was hard to sound convincing when your noble bird was still trying to eat the bishop's hat. The royal council quickly issued a decree. No owls at hunts ever. They were banned from tournaments, royal gardens, and courtly display. And that was that. One nobleman's need to be special turned the owl, nature's quiet philosopher, into a symbol of chaos. Somewhere Beatrice is still hooting, unbothered, waiting for nightfall and an apology. Medieval Europe wasn't exactly known for style. Most people owned one outfit, one bath per season, and one dream, not dying of dysentery. But among the nobility, there was one accessory that truly separated the fashionable from the faithful. The creo, named after Cave, these shoes featured absurdly long, pointy toes that curled upward like they were trying to stab heaven. The longer your points, the higher your status. Some were so exaggerated that noblemen had to tie the tips to their knees with little chains just to walk. A design choice that said, I'm rich but also a danger to myself. Enter Sir Reginald of Essex, a man whose ego could barely fit into his armor. Reginald took footwear seriously. While most nobles stopped their cracks at a modest 6 in, he commissioned a pair nearly 2 feet long, hand-stitched Italian leather, decorated with tiny bells and guaranteed to be noticed by anyone within shouting distance. On Sunday, he wore them to Mass, the medieval equivalent of showing up to church in a Ferrari with your shirt unbuttoned. Unfortunately, the shoes were not built for subtlety. During the procession, one of his pointy toes snagged on a tapestry. The result was spectacular. Reginald tripped, somersaulted forward, and crashed directly into the bishop, taking 2 altar boys and a candelabrum with him. Wax flew. The bishop screamed. The choir stopped mid-hymn. It was, by all accounts, the most exciting thing that had ever happened in that church. The bishop, recovering from what he called a personal assault by vanity, declared long-toed shoes an abomination and distraction from God. Within weeks, the local clergy banned them outright. Other dioceses followed. Before long, cracks were outlawed across Christendom, and Reginald was known not for his style, but for the great trip of St. Albans. Monks preached that the devil lived in those pointy toes. Artists painted demons with matching footwear. And for the first time in history, fashion literally became a sin. Reginald tried to argue it was just an accident, but no one believed him. Pride, they said, always comes before the fall, and sometimes the fall happens right in front of the bishop. The Middle Ages had 2 great passions, piety and partying, often at the same time. And nothing captured that bizarre balance better than the Feast of Fools, an annual festival that was supposed to mock pride and remind everyone of humility. Naturally, it turned into the loudest, drunkest, least humble event in Christendom. The idea was simple. For one glorious day, the lower clergy could act like their superiors. Monks dressed as bishops, choir boys gave sermons, and someone inevitably blessed a goat. The point was to laugh at the absurdity of human vanity. The result, however, was humanity's absurdity, period. Enter Brother Roland, a monk who took fool as a personal challenge. He wasn't just participating in the Feast of Fools, he wanted to win it. He stole the bishop's robes, put sausages in the censer instead of incense, and began blessing the congregation with what one witness described as greasy enthusiasm. The smell alone could have converted an atheist. The crowd roared with laughter. Wine flowed. Someone juggled communion wafers. For a brief, glorious moment, the cathedral felt less like a house of God and more like a medieval comedy club. Then the actual bishop walked in. Imagine the look on his face. Centuries of theology, hierarchy, and holy authority, all undone by a monk waving pork at his parishioners. The bishop didn't speak. He just stared. The way a man stares at a barn that's already on fire. The next morning, the church held a meeting which is medieval for someone's about to be punished. The Feast of Fools was officially condemned as blasphemous and detrimental to clerical dignity. In some places, the penalty for holding one was excommunication. And just like that, centuries of laughter vanished. The church bells that once rang for joy now rang for guilt, all because one monk thought the Eucharist needed more protein. Brother Roland was reassigned to a remote monastery in the Alps, a fate worse than death since the only entertainment there was silence and snow. The Feast of Fools never returned. Humor was deemed dangerous, and the Middle Ages carried on, solemn, sanctimonious, and forever suspicious of sausages. Royal courts loved jesters. They were the medieval version of stand-up comedians, except instead of hecklers, they had executioners. A good jester could make the court roar with laughter. A bad one could make the king roar for the guards. It was quite literally a tough crowd. At the court of King Henry I of England, there lived one such man, Roland Leffel, clever, witty, and tragically unfiltered. Roland's job was simple: keep the monarch entertained and ideally alive with laughter. Unfortunately, he was also a man who didn't know when to stop. Henry was famously touchy about two things: his power and his boldness. Everyone knew this. It was medieval common sense, like not sitting too close to the trebuchet. But one night, after a royal feast and several too many goblets of wine, Roland made the fatal error of combining alcohol, confidence, and comedy. He approached the king, bowed dramatically, and said, "Your Majesty, I dreamt last night that I saw a shining crown upon your head." The room chuckled. Even Henry smiled. Roland, encouraged, added, "Though I think it was just the reflection off your scalp." Silence. The kind of silence that makes you wish for a time machine. The courtiers froze. The musicians stopped. Somewhere, a servant pretended to die just to escape the tension. Henry's smile collapsed like a poorly built fortress. The next day, Roland was arrested for slanderous mockery of royal dignity, which in plain terms means you made fun of the boss. The punishment was swift and horrifyingly creative. His tongue was cut out to prevent further comedy. Henry then issued a decree banning all jokes at the expense of the monarchy. Laughter in the royal court became a dangerous act, a reminder that in medieval politics, humor was treasoning bells. From then on, jesters played it safe. Their routines were limited to juggling fruit and pretending to fall down. The golden age of medieval wit died that night, silenced by one man's ill-timed roast. And so, thanks to Roland Leffel, the English court discovered the first rule of comedy: never punch up when up can have you executed. In medieval Europe, the legal system was less about evidence and more about endurance. If two people disagreed, the simplest solution was obvious: hand them weapons and let God decide. This was trial by combat, justice but with more blood loss. The idea was straightforward. Two opponents would meet in an open field, each claiming divine backing. The logic was that God would never allow an innocent man to die. In practice, he seemed remarkably indecisive. Antonius de Carouge and Jacques Elry, two French nobles in 1386, who managed to turn a lawsuit into France's last officially sanctioned duel. Huge accused Elry of a crime so severe it required heavenly arbitration. The assault of his wife Marguerite denied it. The court stalled, and somewhere between bureaucracy and bloodlust, the king decided, let's just fight about it. The duel was held before the entire Parisian court: priests, nobles, and one very nervous queen. The combatants rode in wearing enough armor to sink a boat. Trumpets sounded, prayers were mumbled, and then they began what chroniclers politely called a ferocious engagement, which is medieval for a mutual attempt at dismemberment. The Gree was faster, stronger, and allegedly better at not dying. But fate or physics favored Cares. After several rounds of smashing each other with divine enthusiasm, Carriages managed to knock his opponent to the ground and stab him through the throat. The crowd erupted. Marguerite wept. The church pretended this was all part of the plan. The problem: a few years later, the king realized that maybe basing justice on swordsmanship wasn't the most reliable system. God, it turned out, might not actually moonlight as a referee. So he quietly banned trial by combat, replacing it with the far less exciting investigation. Carriages was hailed as a hero for about a month before everyone remembered that two men had killed each other to solve what could have been handled by paperwork. Elry was buried. The church side and humanity collectively learned briefly that violence and truth don't mix well. Trial by combat was over. Lawyers, unfortunately, were just beginning. Before plumbing, soap, and common sense, public baths were the pride of medieval cities. They were warm, social, and most importantly, didn't smell like everything else in Europe. Families, travelers, and merchants all gathered in steaming wooden tubs to wash away sin, dirt, and the plague in that order. For a while, everything was perfectly innocent. Men and women bathed together, separated only by a polite nod to modesty and a few strategically placed buckets. It was wholesome, peaceful, almost hygienic. Then came Lord Alaric of Burgundy, a man so spectacularly bad at behaving that he single-handedly turned cleanliness into a moral crisis. All Alaric was rich, bored, and deeply committed to being terrible in public. One summer evening he attended the local bathhouse and brought company. Not his wife, not even someone's wife, several someone's wives. Contemporary accounts say he arrived perfumed, laughing, and underdressed for penance. Within an hour, the bathhouse had transformed from a public utility into the kind of scene that would have made even Dionysus blush. Unfortunately for all Alaric, the local bishop's servant was also there, probably just trying to take a normal bath like a normal person, and ran out screaming. The church launched an investigation, which was medieval code for, "We already know who did it." The fallout was biblical. Sermons condemned the unholy mingling of flesh and filth. Alaric was fined, excommunicated, and forced to build a chapel as penance, and as for everyone else, mixed bathing was banned across the region. Overnight, baths emptied. Men and women were ordered to bathe separately, or better yet, not at all. The moral panic spread faster than fleas. Soon, cities across Europe followed suit. Priests claimed water opened the pores of the soul, making it easier for temptation to sneak in. By the 15th century, bathing itself was viewed with suspicion. Cleanliness, ironically, became dirty. And so, because one noble couldn't control himself in warm water, an entire continent decided to live in filth for centuries. The smell of the Middle Ages wasn't destiny. It was bureaucracy. Thanks to Lord Alaric, the phrase sinful indulgence forever included the act of basic hygiene. In the Middle Ages, bread wasn't just food. It was survival, currency, and occasionally a projectile. For the average peasant, it was the one thing standing between them and a dirt-based diet. But whenever humans rely on something, another human inevitably finds a way to ruin it. Enter Thomas the baker, a man whose business sense was as stale as his bread. London, 1327. Times were hard, flour was expensive, and Thomas had an idea so bad it could only end in legislation. He began patting his loaves with rocks, not pebbles, not gravel. Rocks small enough to hide in the crust, heavy enough to fool a scale, and cheap enough to make a profit. The result? Customers were literally breaking teeth. One unfortunate merchant cracked a myrrh so loudly that the town bailiff heard it from across the market square. Word spread faster than plague gossip. Thomas was dragged before the city officials who examined the evidence. A loaf so heavy it could double as a weapon. Now medieval courts weren't known for subtlety. The solution to fraud was usually hanging, mutilation, or public humiliation. But since Thomas's crime involved bread, they decided to get creative. He was tied to a post, forced to wear a fake loaf on his head, and pelted with his own inventory. It was justice, but with carbs. Afterward, the council passed a new law to prevent future culinary treason. Bakers would now be required to add one extra loaf to every dozen sold, a safeguard against shortchanging, or in this case, dental assault. Thus was born the baker's dozen. Ironically, this act of greed gave birth to one of the most generous traditions in commerce. Every honest baker in London now had to give away free bread, all because Thomas couldn't resist turning lunch into shrapnel. He faded into obscurity, though his legend lived on. The man who made honesty mandatory by being spectacularly dishonest. And somewhere in a medieval tavern, a toothless peasant probably raised a mug and muttered, "At least we got more bread out of it." So next time you buy a dozen donuts and get 13, thank a medieval fraudster with rocks for morals and even worse for baking skills. If you think church music is boring now, imagine it before anyone discovered melody. For most of the Middle Ages, hymns were basically holy mumbling, slow monotone chants designed less to inspire and more to make you forget you were alive. The church liked it that way, predictable, orderly, emotionally bankrupt. Then came Brother Antonius, a monk in 13th century Burgundy with too much imagination and too little supervision. Antonius had grown tired of the same Gregorian drones echoing through the stone halls. So one night, while everyone else was reciting their Kyrie eleison for the millionth time, he decided to add flair. He sang a second note. It was a harmony, just one note above the main chant, perfectly innocent by modern standards, but to medieval ears it was like inventing jazz in a monastery. The other monks froze mid-prayer, staring at him as though Satan himself had joined the choir. Someone dropped a candle. The abbot fainted, and Antonius, blissfully unaware of the crisis he'd just caused, thought, "That sounded kind of nice." The next day he tried it again, this time with enthusiasm. 2-part harmony, then 3. Before long he had half the choir experimenting with tone, pitch, and rhythm. It was by medieval standards a full-blown musical revolution. The problem was that anything new in the Middle Ages was automatically suspected of heresy. Word reached the bishop, who arrived with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for plagues. After listening to one rehearsal, he declared the harmonies an affront to divine simplicity and accused Antonius of summoning worldly pleasure into holy sound. In other words, music was cancelled. Polyphony, the use of multiple notes, was officially banned in several monasteries. For decades, the church returned to its safe, flat chants. Harmony was sinful. Emotion was suspicious. And Brother Antonius, he was reassigned to a silent order, which given his talents was either cruel irony or divine comedy. Centuries later, musicologists would hail him as an accidental pioneer. The man who brought color to a monochrome world and got exiled for it. In the end, his great sin was simple. He made the church sound alive, and for medieval Europe, that was one note too many. Medieval London was a city of wood, straw, and optimism, an architectural combination that practically begged for fire. Add in the average peasant's attention span and you had a recipe for annual disaster. But one fire in particular stood out. The one that made city officials finally say enough. It began, as all great medieval tragedies do, with a man named Geoffrey who was just trying to do his job badly. Geoffrey was an apprentice blacksmith, enthusiastic, clumsy, and one misplaced spark away from historical fame. One chilly evening in 1212, he decided to stay late in the workshop. His master had warned him, "Don't leave the forge unattended." Geoffrey naturally heard, "Please definitely leave the forge unattended." He struck the iron, stoked the flames, and then remembered he was hungry, so he left for dinner in a wooden city with an open fire still burning. By the time he returned, London was a light show. Flames leapt from thatch to timber, spreading faster than medieval gossip. The riverfront went up first, warehouses, taverns, and all. The heat was so intense that the lead roof of St. Mary's Church literally melted and flowed down the street like molten frosting. Contemporary accounts claim people tried to save barrels of ale before saving themselves, which feels historically accurate. The fire raged for days, consuming over 3,000 houses. London's Lord Mayor declared that henceforth, no man shall kindle flame after sunset within the city walls. In other words, bedtime for everyone. Candles, hearths, forges, even lanterns were banned at night. It was the first medieval curfew brought to you by one man's dinner break. Of course, this rule caused its own chaos. Tavern owners complained, bakers rioted, thieves celebrated. The city learned to navigate by moonlight, stubbed toes, and prayer. As for Geoffrey, he vanished from the records, which probably means he either fled or was turned into a cautionary bonfire himself. Either way, London got its first real fire safety policy, centuries before anyone invented insurance. So if you've ever been told to blow out the candle before bed, remember that advice was written in smoke, signed by Geoffrey, and paid for with most of medieval London. In medieval Europe, funerals were solemn affairs, incense, hymns, tears, and the occasional reminder that life expectancy was about 35 on a good day. But leave it to medieval nobility to look at a quiet burial and think, you know what this needs? Violence. It started in 1241, at the funeral of Duke Raymond of Toulouse. A man so wealthy that even his death drew a crowd. Nobles from all over France came to pay respects. And by pay respects, I mean show off their armor and gossip. The problem with gathering armed competitive men in one place is that sooner or later someone suggests a tournament. Enter Sir Aldrich de Vian, a knight described by one chronicler as a man of enthusiasm but little restraint. While mirrors filed past the coffin, Aldrich nudged his friend and said, "Wouldn't Raymond have loved one last joust?" His friend, being equally stupid, agreed. Within the hour, lances were fetched, horses saddled, and the solemn funeral procession turned into a spontaneous melee. What began as a memorial tilt quickly devolved into chaos. A squire tripped over a casket rope. A knight missed his target and impaled a banner. One unfortunate monk was launched into a puddle of holy water. The coffin itself tipped over mid-charge, releasing the late duke into what must have been the worst encore in history. By the time it ended, 3 knights were injured, 1 church window was gone, and the abbot had a nervous breakdown. The clergy called an emergency council the next morning, and with the full fury of bureaucratic piety, they issued a decree. No games, tournaments, nor feats of arms shall take place in proximity to the burial of the dead. In other words, no more jousting at funerals. The ruling spread across Europe, and for once everyone agreed it was reasonable. Funeral organizers went back to mourning quietly. Knights went back to finding other ways to get concussed. And the church added another entry to its ever-growing list of rules created because someone couldn't behave. Duke Raymond was rearied with all due reverence, minus the jousting. His legacy lived on not for his deeds, but because his funeral became the medieval equivalent of a YouTube fail compilation. Medieval feasts were chaos in edible form. Imagine hundreds of nobles, knights, and clergy packed into a hall that smelled like meat, and mild regret. Tables groaned under roasted boar, stewed eels, pies of uncertain origin, and an ocean of alcohol. It was a time to eat, drink, and more importantly, show everyone that your digestion was better than theirs. For years, these feasts went about as well as anything medieval ever did. Minor food poisoning, occasional sword fights, and at least 1 minstrel catching fire. But then came Sir Baldwin of Burgundy, a knight whose relationship with alcohol could be described as committed but abusive. It was the Feast of St. Martin, a celebration that began as a religious event and ended as a competitive drinking tournament. Sir Baldwin arrived late, already wobbling, wearing armor polished to a shine, and a grin that spelled doom. He immediately downed 3 goblets of wine to catch up. Then another for St. Martin and 1 more for symmetry. An hour later, the kitchen presented the centerpiece, a glorious roasted chicken meant for the Duke himself. Baldwin saw it, decided divine providence had placed it there for him, and lunged. Unfortunately, another knight, sober, hungry, and less amused, lunged too. The 2 men grappled, cursed, and eventually drew swords over poultry. The hall erupted, chairs broke, goblets shattered, and 1 terrified priest hid under the table with the pies. The brawl spread faster than confession rumors. By dawn, 3 men were dead, 12 injured, and the Duke's banquet hall looked like the aftermath of a food fight in hell. The church, horrified, declared public feasts a breeding ground for gluttony and sin. The crown agreed, banning open feasting and replacing it with smaller, morally supervised dinners. In other words, no fun allowed. Sir Baldwin survived barely and reportedly woke up 2 days later asking if he'd won. His legacy outlived him, not in honor or valor, but as the man who made overeating illegal. So next time someone ruins a party, remember at least they didn't end an entire European tradition over a chicken leg. The Middle Ages didn't need pandemics to cancel events. They had Baldwin. The University of Paris in the 14th century was Europe's intellectual crown jewel, a place of debate, discovery, and occasional fires. It produced philosophers, theologians, and at least 1 man who made education illegal for everyone else. That man was Etienne of Rouen, a student of theology with big dreams and even bigger delusions. Etienne wasn't content with memorizing Latin or arguing about angels on pinheads. He wanted results, real magical world-bending results. Unfortunately, his definition of research involved less Aristotle and more necromancy. It began harmlessly enough. Etienne bragged to his classmates that he could summon a spirit to help him pass his exams. They laughed, as all smart people do before something explodes. Determined to prove himself, he borrowed a forbidden grimoire from a Dominican friar and decided to conduct his great experiment in the dormitory basement, because that's where all brilliant disasters begin. By candlelight, surrounded by chicken bones and the smell of wet parchment, Etienne chanted his spell. At first, nothing happened. Then the temperature dropped, the candles flickered, and something began to growl from under the floorboards. Accounts vary on what exactly emerged. Some say a demon, others a very angry cat. Either way, Etienne screamed, tripped, and kicked over a lamp. The result, 1 collapsed staircase, 2 terrified scholars, and a building that burned for 2 days. When the smoke cleared, Etienne was found singed but alive, clutching the book and insisting it almost worked. The university disagreed. The rector banned the study of all occult and infernal arts on campus, declaring that the pursuit of wisdom shall not involve sulfur. Other universities quickly followed suit, outlawing astrology, alchemy, and anything that made professors nervous. Etienne was expelled, excommunicated, and later rumored to be tutoring peasants in applied invisibility, which probably meant hiding from creditors. The church cited his fiasco as proof that unchecked curiosity leads to ruin, a moral they've been repeating ever since. And that's how one overeager student turned magic from a subject of study into a sin. Universities traded spells for syllabi in Europe, entered a new era of safe, unimaginative scholarship. All because Etienne tried to cheat on his finals with Satan as his study partner. Every kingdom had a bard, the medieval version of a YouTuber with a lute. They sang heroic ballads, flattered nobles, and occasionally slipped in jokes sharp enough to get them killed. But one bard went too far, and in doing so, made sure nobody in England ever laughed freely again. His name was Thomas of Norwich, a wandering musician known for his quick wit and poor sense of self-preservation. Thomas had entertained the courts of England for years with harmless humor, mostly about monks, merchants, and the French. But in 1314, King Edward II gave him a new audience, and his final mistake. Edward wasn't exactly popular. He had just lost disastrously at Bannockburn. His nobles hated him, and his love life was the talk of every tavern. In short, the perfect subject for a comedy set. Thomas, apparently unaware of the term too soon, decided to perform his latest song, the Ballad of the Cowardly King. The lyrics were clever, the rhyme impeccable, and the crowd howled with laughter for about 30 seconds. Then the room went quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens when everyone suddenly remembers they enjoy breathing. Edward didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He simply turned to his guards and said, "Arrest the musician." Thomas was dragged from the hall mid-rhyme. The next morning, the king issued a decree banning any verse, song, or public utterance, bringing dishonor upon the crown. It was the medieval equivalent of deleting the comment section. Minstrels across the realm panicked. Some rewrote their songs to be purely flattering. Others fled to Scotland, where jokes about English kings were considered national treasures. As for Thomas, he wasn't executed, which frankly was merciful by medieval standards. Instead, he was banished from every royal court in England, condemned to perform only in taverns. He spent his remaining years singing about love, wine, and hypothetical monarchs who resembled no one in particular. His ban lived on. Satire became dangerous. Humor became heresy, and kings learned that nothing travels faster than a good insult except maybe an arrest warrant. Thomas of Norwich vanished from history soon after, but his legacy endures. The man who proved that in the Middle Ages it wasn't the sword that killed, it was the punchline. In most corners of ancient Greece, the arrival of a baby girl brought sighs of quiet resignation. Daughters were destined for weaving, marriage, and obedience, background figures in the grand drama of their fathers and brothers. But in Sparta, the cradle rocked to a different rhythm. When a Spartan girl entered the world, she was not judged by her gender, but by her strength. At birth, midwives inspected her body, checking her limbs, her cry, her vitality. If she appeared weak or sickly, she faced the same grim fate as any unfit boy: exposure on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. In this harsh system, mercy bowed before survival. Sparta's creed was simple: only the strong should live. From her first breath, a Spartan girl belonged not merely to her family, but to the state. The city itself was her guardian and her purpose. Her parents might nurture her, but Sparta shaped her destiny. She was not to be hidden in domestic silence or wrapped in layers of modesty. Instead, she was to grow loud, proud, and unbreakable. Her duty was clear: to one day give birth to sons who would die for Sparta, and to be strong enough to endure that truth without weeping. Even her appearance reflected the state's values. While Athenian women were pale from staying indoors, Spartan girls tanned under the open sky. Their hair was kept short for practicality. Their limbs hardened from constant motion. The body was a weapon, and it had to be trained. They ran, they wrestled. They threw the javelin, and they learned rhythm through dance, not for vanity, but to cultivate control and precision. In Sparta, beauty was measured in symmetry, not softness, in vitality, not fragility. From childhood, Spartan girls heard the same words repeated in the agora and the home alike: "You give birth to warriors, not cowards." That sentence was both a compliment and a command. The city expected its daughters to be fearless, outspoken, and loyal above all else. Their strength was the foundation of the state's survival, because without resilient mothers, there could be no resilient soldiers. And thus, from infancy, every Spartan girl was born not just into a family, but into a mission. From the moment a Spartan girl could walk, her world became a living arena. Childhood in Sparta was not defined by dolls or domestic lessons, but by running tracks, wrestling grounds, and communal instruction. While boys entered the AOG, the harsh military training system, girls underwent their own version of discipline, guided not by soldiers but by the state's philosophy. The belief was simple and absolute: Strong women produced strong sons. The female body was not a symbol of frailty, but a vessel of civic power. Every lesson, every race, every competition was a rehearsal for the greatest responsibility Sparta demanded: motherhood in service to the state. A typical day for a young Spartan girl began at dawn. She would rise to the sound of commands echoing from the boys' training fields and join other girls for group exercises. There were no veils, no embroidery, no soft corners. Barefoot, they ran along the Euretas River, learning to breathe through pain and heat. They wrestled one another, developing both strength and stamina. They hurled the discus and the javelin, competing with ferocity usually reserved for men in other city-states. The aim was not sport, it was transformation. By mastering her body, a girl mastered her mind. Education extended beyond the physical. Spartan girls were also taught music, poetry, and the laws of Laius, the legendary lawgiver who shaped the Spartan constitution. Singing together in choruses during festivals, they learned rhythm, unity, and public confidence. Their songs praised courage and mocked cowardice, reinforcing the city's values in every lyric. Through these public performances, young women gained a rare form of social power in the ancient world: visibility. Unlike Athenian women who lived behind high walls, Spartan girls stood in public, laughed, sang, and competed before men without shame. The community watched them grow, not with indulgence but with expectation. Every gesture was seen as a reflection of the city's ideals. Teachers encouraged boldness in speech and endurance in spirit. A Spartan girl was told to look a man in the eyes and to speak her mind with clarity and pride. Childhood was not a prelude to obedience. It was an initiation into strength. By adolescence, she had already learned the art of discipline, resilience, and controlled pride, the cornerstones of what it meant to be a daughter of Sparta. In Sparta, the female body was not to be hidden or softened. It was to be perfected. Physical excellence was seen as sacred duty. A Spartan girl's training began early and intensified through her teenage years. She ran over hills, sprinted across fields, and swam in the cold waters of the Euretas River. Wrestling, discus throwing, and javelin practice toughened her muscles and sharpened her reflexes. There was no shame in sweat or bruises. They were marks of honor. To the Spartan mind, every sinew of strength she gained meant a stronger generation to come. She was a future mother of soldiers, and weakness was treason. Unlike in Athens or Corinth, where modesty confined women to the household, in Sparta, physical training took place outdoors, often in public. It shocked visitors from other Greek cities. They whispered of immodesty and indecency, horrified to see girls exercising without the concealment of long robes. But Spartans dismissed such criticism. To them, the human body was not a source of shame, but a symbol of discipline. They believed the gods favored symmetry and health, not frail elegance. The sculpted form of a Spartan woman was proof of divine and civic order. Training was relentless. Girls raced against one another in contests that mirrored the men's Olympic events: short sprints, long jumps, discus, and wrestling matches. Victors were crowned with wreaths and celebrated publicly. Even losing was not disgraceful. Cowardice was. The state rewarded effort, not outcome. This constant movement built not only muscle, but also endurance and confidence. It made them fearless, agile, and aware of their physical limits, and more importantly, how to overcome them. The rhythm of their training shaped their identity. When their brothers returned from the Agi covered in scars, the girls greeted them not with pity, but with pride. They understood pain as part of the same sacred duty. In Sparta, men and women were two halves of the same ideal: strength in service of the state. Physical fitness was never vanity. It was patriotism in flesh and bone. Through this rigorous education, Spartan girls became living monuments of discipline, their bodies the temples in which the strength of Sparta itself was preserved. If the body was Sparta's weapon, the mind was its blade. Spartan girls were trained to sharpen both. Physical training forged strength, but mental discipline gave it direction. From childhood, girls learned to control emotion, suppress fear, and think logically. They were not sheltered from harsh truths, death, war, or loss, because those realities defined their existence. They grew up hearing that their brothers might die in battle, their fathers might never return, and that their role was not to mourn, but to endure. Emotional restraint became second nature. A Spartan girl learned to stand tall, speak directly, and face adversity without trembling. Education in Sparta included more than athletics. Girls were taught literacy, an uncommon privilege for women in the Greek world. They learned to read, write, recite poetry, and debate. This intellectual education was not aimed at turning them into philosophers, but into women capable of raising disciplined, intelligent citizens. They studied the laws of Liarus, the founding principles of Spartan society, equality among citizens, self-control, and devotion to the state. These ideas became moral commandments drilled into memory through repetition and song. Public speaking, too, was a valued skill. Spartan girls were trained to express themselves clearly and confidently, a quality that astonished outsiders. They did not lower their eyes or speak softly as Athenian women were expected to do. Instead, they looked men directly in the face and spoke their thoughts without hesitation. Spartan men admired such boldness. It was seen not as arrogance but as integrity. The city wanted women who could instruct their sons in courage and discipline, and such instruction required a strong voice. Mockery was another weapon of the Spartan mind. During festivals, girls sang choral songs that ridiculed cowardice among men. These verses were not idle teasing. They were moral enforcement. To be mocked publicly by women for cowardice was a disgrace worse than defeat in battle. Thus, women's words became instruments of social control, shaping behavior through both admiration and shame. In this way, the Spartan girl's intellect became as vital as her strength. She was trained to command respect not only through muscle but through wit, composure, and unshakable clarity, a mind as disciplined as her body. When a Spartan girl reached her late teens, her transformation from athlete to woman came through a ritual unlike any other in Greece. Marriage by contest, not consent. Spartan weddings were strange, even violent by other city-state standards. The bride's head was shaved, her garments exchanged for a man's cloak, and she was left alone in the dark. The groom, after a communal meal with his comrades, would sneak away to meet her secretly. This act symbolized the merging of equals, not the domination of one over the other. Marriage in Sparta was less about romance and more about breeding strength. The state did not celebrate affection. It celebrated endurance, fertility, and discipline. Before marriage, a young woman's reputation depended on her prowess. Athletic skill and visible vitality were seen as the greatest dowry. Spartan men admired robust women, those who could run, wrestle, and bear children without weakness. Love poems and perfume were irrelevant. Physical excellence was erotic in itself. To be admired for strength, not softness, was the Spartan ideal, and yet these marriages carried a peculiar emotional distance. Husbands often continued to live in barracks until their 30s, visiting their wives only in secret. This separation was intentional. It kept their passion fierce, their discipline intact, and ensured that desire remained an exercise of willpower, not indulgence. Infidelity, by contrast, carried less stigma in Sparta than elsewhere in Greece. The state's priority was not personal virtue, but healthy offspring. Older men might allow younger warriors to father children with their wives if it promised strong heirs. The practice shocked outsiders but reflected Sparta's ruthless pragmatism. Every womb belonged in essence to the state. For the women themselves, marriage did not mean submission. A Spartan wife retained authority in the household, managed estates, and oversaw helot laborers while her husband served in the military. Far from being silent homemakers, they were administrators of property and preservers of lineage. Their independence astonished and scandalized Greek visitors who saw in Sparta a world turned upside down where men died for the city and women kept it alive. Marriage in this society was not an end to freedom, but its continuation through duty, a covenant between two disciplined souls serving the same unyielding God. Sparta itself. To be a mother in Sparta was not a quiet domestic affair. It was the most sacred and demanding duty a woman could fulfill. From the moment of birth, motherhood was treated as an act of civic devotion. A Spartan woman's worth was measured not by beauty, wealth, or charm, but by the strength and courage of her children. Bearing sons who could serve and die for the city was her highest honor. Yet motherhood here did not soften her. It hardened her further. Spartan mothers were expected to face childbirth without fear, to endure pain and silence, and to greet the cries of newborns not with tenderness, but with pride. Every child born in Sparta was a potential warrior, and every woman was a guardian of that destiny. From the cradle, a mother began shaping her child's spirit. "Come back with your shield," or "on it," she would one day tell her son before battle, words that became a national motto. Such phrases were not poetic exaggerations. They were spoken truths. A Spartan woman who mourned too publicly or who wept excessively for her fallen son was shamed. Her grief was expected to be silent, dignified, and laced with pride. The city demanded not tears but legacy. Even the way mothers raised daughters reflected the same principle. They did not teach submissiveness, but resilience. Spartan girls were told stories of women who had sent multiple sons to war and rejoiced in their bravery. They learned that weakness was not just personal failure, but a civic flaw. The ideal mother was not merely a nurturer. She was a living emblem of self-control and strength. Her voice molded the ethos of the home just as the Aeog molded the men. These women also wielded surprising authority. While their husbands served in distant campaigns, Spartan mothers managed property, helots, and family affairs with full autonomy. Their control over estates gave them financial power unseen elsewhere in Greece. But with that power came immense pressure. To uphold Spartan values, to ensure discipline never faltered, and to raise children worthy of the ancestors. To be a Spartan mother was to live in permanent service to the state, balancing affection with austerity. In her endurance, Sparta found its eternal strength. While Spartan men spent most of their lives in the barracks or at war, it was the women who managed the city's wealth. This unusual circumstance transformed Spartan society into one of the few in the ancient world where women held genuine economic power. They owned land, controlled estates, and oversaw vast numbers of helot laborers. By some estimates, women possessed nearly 40% of all Spartan property, an unthinkable figure in the rest of Greece. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. To Sparta, it was efficiency. The city entrusted its survival not only to its warriors, but to its women's discipline and competence. Managing wealth in Sparta was not about luxury or excess. Spartan women were forbidden to flaunt gold or foreign fashions. Their riches were tools of stability, not vanity. They directed harvests, distributed food, maintained livestock, and ensured that the military system functioned while men were absent. In essence, they became the administrators of the Spartan war machine's economic heart. Their success or failure directly affected the soldiers' ability to fight and thus the city's fate. This authority made them respected, but it also made them feared. Their sharp tongues and decisive manners shocked visitors who expected docility. The political influence of women was indirect but undeniable. A Spartan mother's opinion could sway her son's courage. A wife's ridicule could shame a husband into valor. Their voices carried moral weight in public discourse, shaping how honor and duty were perceived. They didn't sit in councils or hold titles, but their presence was felt in every decision that touched the household, and the household was the foundation of the state. Naturally, this power drew criticism. Greek writers like Aristotle accused Spartan women of arrogance, claiming they ruled over their men and corrupted the state's discipline. Such accusations reveal more about foreign discomfort than Spartan reality. In truth, these women upheld the very order that made Sparta feared across the Greek world. They were the invisible hands behind the iron front, guardians of wealth, enforcers of virtue, and custodians of stability. The Spartan woman, wealthy yet austere, embodied a paradox. She ruled a household yet served the state, commanding power while submitting to duty. A queen within invisible borders, loyal only to Sparta. In most Greek cities, a woman's silence was considered her virtue, but in Sparta, silence was cowardice. Spartan women were famous or infamous for their bold speech. They mocked, praised, and commanded with a sharpness that startled outsiders. Their words carried authority, and their wit was legendary. They didn't whisper behind closed doors. They spoke in the public square at festivals and even to kings. When a Spartan mother handed her son a shield and said, "With it or on it," she wasn't merely giving advice. She was issuing a command. Her voice was the echo of the state itself. The education of Spartan girls in rhetoric, music, and poetry prepared them for this public presence. Festivals like the Gymnopedia and the Hyacinthia featured women's choruses that sang before crowds, weaving moral lessons into song. These performances were not entertainment. They were civic speeches disguised as art. The choruses praised bravery and mocked cowardice, using ridicule as a weapon to reinforce Spartan values. A man who faltered in battle risked more than death. He risked hearing his name sung in scorn by the women of Sparta. Even kings were not immune to their judgment. Queen Gorgo, wife of King Leonidas, was known across Greece for her sharp intelligence and fearless speech. When a foreign woman once asked why Spartan women were the only ones who ruled their men, Gorgo replied, "Because we are the only ones who give birth to men." Her words captured the essence of Spartan femininity, proud, unapologetic, and rooted in duty rather than submission. Gorgo's voice, like those of countless unnamed women, reflected a society that valued moral clarity above obedience. Speech in Sparta was a form of discipline. Women's words were expected to be concise, clever, and cutting, just like the blades their sons carried. Their language forged unity. Their songs preserved tradition, and their criticism maintained courage. Through words alone, they upheld the moral spine of the city. Outsiders saw insolence. Spartans saw integrity. To speak truth boldly, even to men of power, was not rebellion. It was service. In their voices, Sparta heard its conscience, sharp as iron and steady as the rhythm of marching feet. When Sparta finally fell, its armies defeated and its glory dimmed, the legacy of its women endured longer than its walls. Historians and poets across Greece continued to speak of them with awe and unease. To some, they were monsters of pride. Women who dared to speak as men, rule as men, and train as men. To others, they were marvels of discipline and dignity, the silent architects of a city built on strength. Even Athens, Sparta's rival in every way, grudgingly admired the steel of its daughters. For while Spartan men made the city famous through war, it was Spartan women who kept it alive through generations of sacrifice and endurance. Their legacy was not confined to physical prowess or patriotic motherhood. It was a cultural revolution. They redefined what it meant to be female in the ancient world. Not fragile, not ornamental, but essential. They stood as living proof that the body of a woman could be a political instrument, a weapon of continuity, and a symbol of moral order. Their training, their speech, and their stoicism shaped a society unlike any other in history. Sparta's daughters were not taught submission. They were taught symmetry of body, mind, and spirit. Even centuries later, their influence lingered in myth and memory. Travelers who visited the ruins of Sparta would hear tales of mothers who sent 5 sons to war and rejoiced when all fell bravely. They would see statues of women standing tall beside hoplites, not behind them. The image of the Spartan woman became both legend and warning, a reminder of the power a society grants when it demands strength from all its citizens, not just its men. In a world where most women were confined to shadows, the Spartan woman walked in daylight. Her body was trained, her mind disciplined, her voice respected. She lived not for luxury, but for purpose, to uphold the fragile balance of a warrior state that depended as much on her fortitude as on the men's swords. Though the city that created her is long gone, her legacy endures as one of history's most radical experiments. A civilization that built its power not just on warriors, but on the women who made warriors possible. Beyond the golden gates of Topkapi Palace, past the tiled courtyards and marble fountains, there lay a forbidden world that few men ever saw, the imperial harem. To foreign ambassadors, it was whispered about as a paradise of pleasure, filled with exotic women serving the sultan's desires. But those who truly understood the empire knew that behind those silk curtains was not a playground of passion, but a battlefield of politics. Every glance, every whisper, every favor could shift the balance of power in the Ottoman court. The harem was not merely a household. It was an empire within an empire. At its heart lived hundreds of women from across the known world. Circassians, Georgians, Greeks, Persians, Ukrainians, and Arabs, each brought to the palace as tribute, captives, or gifts. Most arrived as frightened teenagers, stripped of family and freedom. Yet some would rise higher than any vizier or general, because inside the harem, the sultan's affection was only the beginning. True survival required intelligence, charm, and an understanding of intrigue that rivaled any minister's cunning. The harem was organized like a military structure, each woman assigned a place in its hierarchy. At the bottom were the odalisques, the servants, girls who swept marble floors, tended lamps, and dressed their superiors. Above them were the concubines, chosen for their beauty or wit, waiting for a chance to catch the sultan's eye. Those who succeeded might become favorites, their chambers adorned with silk and silver, their names whispered throughout the palace. Yet each promotion came with peril. A wrong word, a jealous rival, or a shift in the sultan's favor could end a woman's fortune overnight. Above all others reigned the valid sultan, the sultan's mother. Her authority was absolute within the harem, her word law even to her son. She controlled the staff, oversaw education, and arranged marriages within the royal household. Valid Sultan was the silent architect of dynasties, her power rivaling that of any grand vizier. To understand the Ottoman court, one had to understand her influence, the invisible hand guiding the throne. Behind jeweled screens and velvet cushions, she ruled not through force, but through mastery of human ambition. In the harem, power was soft-spoken, perfumed, and absolutely deadly. Every woman's journey in the Ottoman harem began at the lowest tier as an odalisque. The word meant chambermaid. But within those marble walls, it carried far heavier meaning. Odalisques were not courtesans or companions. They were servants, the invisible machinery of the sultan's private world. Most were young girls purchased or gifted to the palace from across the vast Ottoman territories, Silesia, Georgia, Greece, Albania, or the Balkans. Torn from their homes, they were brought into a world where obedience meant survival, and silence was a language of its own. The harem was their universe, and its rules were absolute. Each odalisque was assigned to a mistress, perhaps a concubine, a favorite, or a royal princess. whom she would serve loyally. They cleaned, dressed, bathed, and waited on their superiors from dawn until dusk. In time, the most disciplined and graceful among them could earn a promotion to higher ranks, but disobedience or clumsiness meant demotion, or worse, expulsion from the palace, a fate considered worse than death for those who had once breathed the air of Topkapi. Despite their status as servants, odalisks were not neglected. They were carefully educated and trained to fit the empire's refined aesthetic. Tutors taught them music, poetry, manners, embroidery, and the art of movement. Palace physicians ensured they stayed in perfect health while eunuchs oversaw their discipline. Beauty was not enough. A girl had to embody poise, intelligence, and grace. The Sultan's court demanded more than decoration. It demanded perfection. The possibility that one day the Sultan might notice her, even in passing, kept many odalisks alive with quiet hope. But beneath that hope simmered rivalry. Every girl knew that one fortunate glance from the Sultan could elevate her above hundreds of others. Behind gentle smiles, envy brewed like poison. Friends could become enemies overnight. Whispered gossip could decide a future. And yet within this fragile order, alliances also formed, small sisterhoods of survival among the powerless. The odalisk's life was both a cage and a ladder. For most, it ended in quiet service. But for a rare few, it became the first step on a path toward unimaginable influence. A climb from servitude to sovereignty, one silken step at a time. From among hundreds of odalisks, a select few were elevated to a new and perilous rank, concubine of the Sultan. This promotion was not merely a privilege. It was an initiation into the empire's most dangerous game. To become a concubine meant being chosen, not for service, but for the possibility of intimacy with the ruler of the world's most powerful Islamic empire. Yet this honor was as much a burden as it was a dream. For the moment a girl caught the Sultan's eye, her life was no longer her own. She belonged to him, body and soul, and her worth would now be measured by her ability to please, to charm, and ultimately to produce an heir. The chosen concubines underwent a complete transformation. They were dressed in luxurious silks, perfumed with rose oil, and adorned with jewels that once belonged to fallen queens. Their behavior was reshaped by tutors who taught them the refined arts of conversation, poetry, and etiquette. They learned how to move gracefully, to dance with restraint, and to speak in the soft, melodic Turkish of the palace. But beneath the elegance lay an unspoken truth: beauty without cunning was useless. Many concubines discovered that surviving the Sultan's favor required intelligence sharper than any blade. Not all concubines ever met the Sultan. The harem was enormous, and only a handful were ever summoned to his chambers. For those who were, the encounter could change everything. If the Sultan was pleased, the woman might become a cadden, an official consort with her own quarters, servants, and privileges. If not, she might fade back into obscurity, her silks replaced by linen, her hope extinguished. Jealousy thrived in these corridors. A smile from the Sultan to one woman could spark quiet fury in 100 others. Rumors spread like smoke, and alliances were made or broken in whispers. Eunuchs guarded the doors, but no guard could stop ambition. For each concubine, the path upward was paved with charm and deceit alike. Her rivals were not her enemies alone. They were her reflections, each one dreaming of the same impossible ascent to bear the Sultan's child, and with it claim a sliver of immortality in the empire's golden history. Above the concubines rose a select few known as the Guzda, meaning the favored ones. These women were no longer servants. They were the Sultan's chosen companions, the elite circle whose smiles could bend the empire's destiny. To be named a favorite was to live under constant scrutiny and intoxicating privilege. Their chambers shimmered with gold-threaded drapes and marble fountains. Their meals were served on silver trays. Their gowns were sewn from the rarest silks of Versailles, but luxury came with invisible chains. The Sultan's love was fickle, and the higher a woman climbed, the deadlier the fall. Augusta had succeeded where hundreds failed. She had captured the Sultan's affection, yet affection alone was not enough. Her true test was endurance. To remain in favor, she had to embody grace, intelligence, and restraint at all times. A single misstep, a careless word, or a whisper of jealousy could strip her of everything. Favorites became masters of diplomacy, fluent in the subtle language of the palace. They learned when to flatter, when to fall silent, and when to plant an idea in the Sultan's mind so gently that he believed it was his own. Many Gazda became quiet political players, using their influence to secure positions for allies or favor certain advisors. Through them, the harem's invisible hand extended into the empire's politics. A smile at the right banquet or a word whispered through the valid sultan could change the course of a vizier's career. Yet these intrigues were carried out with surgical precision. The sultan's heart was the battlefield and flattery was the weapon. But perhaps the most perilous moment for a favorite came when affection deepened into attachment. If she bore the sultan a child, especially a son, she would rise even higher. But her life would also grow infinitely more dangerous. The other favorites would watch her with suspicion. Rivals would conspire and eunuchs would listen for signs of arrogance. Many Augusta met her end not through the sultan's wrath, but through poison poured by jealous hands. Within those perfumed halls, survival depended on balance, the ability to stay beloved yet never threatening, adored but never indispensable. To be a favorite was to dance daily on the blade of empire. To bear the sultan's child was to cross a line few women ever reached. A transformation from concubine to cadin, an official consort of the sultan. With motherhood came both reverence and risk. The cadins were the mothers of princes, the future of the Ottoman dynasty, and thus the most valuable and vulnerable women in the empire. Their lives revolved around one mission, to ensure their son's survival and, if fate allowed, his ascension to the throne. In a world where power flowed through bloodlines, the womb was a weapon. Each cardin was granted her own private apartments within the harem, complete with servants, attendants, and eunuchs. Her status depended on the sultan's affection, but even more on the gender of her child. To give birth to a daughter brought honor. To bear a son brought power. The boy would be raised by tutors trained in war and governance while his mother became his protector, advisor, and political strategist. From that moment on, her future was bound entirely to his. If he rose, she would rise with him. If he fell, her fall would be swift and often fatal. Competition among the cardins was relentless. The harem, though veiled in silence and beauty, was built on rivalry. Each mother watched the others with polite smiles and quiet calculation. They exchanged gifts and compliments, but their hearts guarded suspicions sharper than daggers. The death of one prince meant safety for another. An accident in the nursery could alter the empire's succession. Even the Valida Sultan, the sultan's mother, observed these rivalries with caution, knowing that too much ambition among the cadins could ignite chaos in the palace. Still, these women were not powerless pawns. They were educated, eloquent, and skilled in persuasion. Their letters to the sultan were crafted like poetry, their conversations filled with flattery and subtle influence. Through them, foreign ambassadors found allies and vizier found enemies. In the sultan's private moments, the cardin's voice could shape decisions that would echo across the empire. Yet beneath all the silk and ceremony lay a cruel truth. Their glory was temporary, their peace fragile. In the Ottoman harem, motherhood was both a crown and a curse, a gift that could lead either to immortality or to ruin. At the very summit of affection stood the Hki Sultan, the sultan's chief consort, his official favorite, and often the mother of his most beloved children. To become Hayski was to rise from the scented shadows of the harem into the light of power itself. Her name was spoken in the same breath as viziers and parshas. Her influence reached beyond the harem's laddies' walls and into the empire's political heart. Yet the path to this title was paved with brilliance, calculation, and often blood. The word Hki meant the chosen one, and the woman who bore it was unlike any other in the harem. She had captivated the sultan not just through beauty, but through intellect, composure, and timing. Her days were spent in a delicate balance of love and politics, comforting the ruler of an empire while subtly shaping his decisions. No official decree could name her as ruler, yet her whispers could decide wars, marriages, and executions. She was the invisible vizier of the sultan's heart. Her chambers were palaces within palaces. Adorned with Isnik tiles and perfumed gardens, they symbolized her unparalleled status. Dozens of odalisques and eunuchs attended her every need. Yet even in this luxury, the Hki Sultan walked a tightrope of danger. Her power rested entirely on one man's favor, and the harem was filled with eyes waiting for her to stumble. A single illness, a rumor, or the birth of another woman's son could threaten her position overnight. To survive, she needed both love and fear. Love from the sultan and fear from everyone else. History remembers the most legendary of them all, Hurram Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana. A former slave from Runia, she rose to become the lawful wife of Sultan Sulian the Magnificent, something no concubine had achieved in centuries. Her intelligence and political cunning transformed the empire's inner court, making her one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. Yet her rise also marked the beginning of an age of intrigue. The sultanate of women, when mothers and wives shaped the throne through charm, letters, and whispered manipulation. To be the Heki Sultan was to wear the crown of affection, and the dagger of envy pressed eternally against one's heart. Above every woman in the harem, above the concubines, the favorites, even the Haki, stood the valid sultan, the sultan's mother. Her word was law within those perfumed walls, her authority absolute. She did not compete for affection. She possessed something far greater, legitimacy. As the mother of the reigning sultan, she held the one relationship that could never be replaced. While lovers might come and go, the mother's position was eternal, and her influence extended beyond the palace into the very heart of imperial power. The valid sultan occupied her own lavish apartments known as the valid Dersi, a palace within the palace. Hundreds of servants, eunuchs, and attendants served her, and her wealth rivaled that of the Grand Vizier. She oversaw every aspect of the harem: discipline, education, appointments, and punishments. Every woman, from the lowest odalisque to the sultan's favored consort, ultimately bowed before her authority. She decided who entered the sultan's chambers, who bore his children, and who would be quietly dismissed. Her influence reached even into the empire's politics. Foreign ambassadors sought her favor, knowing that a few well-placed words from her could alter the sultan's mood or his alliances. But her power came at a heavy cost. The valid sultan lived surrounded by ambition and deceit, even from within her own bloodline. She was both protector and rival to the women who might one day replace her. Her son's favorites, her grandson's mothers, her potential successors. The Ottoman court was a serpent's nest, and the Valida's wisdom was her only shield. Those who lacked cunning were quickly consumed. The most legendary among them, Qasim Sultan and Tarhan Sultan, wielded immense influence, commanding armies, managing state affairs, and at times even ruling in place of child sultans. Their reigns marked the pinnacle of female power in Ottoman history. Yet even for the valid sultan, life was a game of balance. Too much control risked alienating her son. Too little invited chaos within the harem. She ruled with velvet gloves over iron hands, maintaining order through fear wrapped in grace. The Valadier was not merely the sultan's mother. She was the empire's heartbeat, the matriarch behind the veil, the queen whose throne was carved not from gold but from obedience. No story of the Ottoman harem can be told without the silent figures who guarded, managed, and often manipulated it from the shadows. The eunuchs, to the outside world, they were servants. Within the harem, they were gatekeepers, spies, and sometimes kingmakers. Castrated as boys and brought from Africa or the Balkans, they were cut off from ordinary life and remade into instruments of imperial control. Between the sultan's private chambers and the labyrinth of women's quarters, the eunuchs stood as the unbreakable wall. Men without lineage, without personal ambition, devoted entirely to the palace. Or at least that was the theory. At the top of this hidden hierarchy was the Kuzla Arsar, the chief black eunuch, one of the most powerful figures in the Ottoman Empire. His keys unlocked the harem gates, and his words reached the sultan's ears faster than any visors. He oversaw all correspondence between the harem and the outside world, carrying messages from the valid sultan, arranging marriages for royal daughters, and managing the vast estates that funded the harem's luxury. In an empire obsessed with rank and purity, his unusual position, neither fully male nor fully servant, gave him a freedom unmatched by any official. He could move where no man could go and hear what no minister dared say. But beneath the ritual and loyalty thrived ambition. Many eunuchs used their proximity to power to build immense fortunes and political influence. Some became patrons of mosques, schools, and markets, their names etched into the architecture of Istanbul. The Kuzla Arsar often acted as an intermediary between the sultan's mother and the imperial council, shaping policies from behind the veil. His allegiance could determine who lived in favor and who fell from grace. A whispered warning or a withheld letter could destroy a life overnight. Yet for all their authority, eunuchs were prisoners, too. They lived within the palace walls, bound by duty and isolation, their loyalty enforced by fear and dependence. They were the unseen machinery that kept the harem running. The quiet balance between love and death, chaos and control. In their silence, they ruled an empire of whispers, and through them, the harem itself became the most secret government in the world. As centuries passed, the harem that once pulsed with political intrigue and whispered ambition began to fade. The power that had once shaped empires slowly withered under the weight of change. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the Ottoman world was no longer the same. Wars were lost, reforms were demanded, and Western influence seeped into the empire's veins. The great days of the sultanate of women, when mothers and wives ruled from behind silk curtains, were over. Yet even in decline, the harem remained a mirror of Ottoman society, elegant, disciplined, and dangerous all at once. The number of women inside the harem dwindled, and the grandeur of its rituals softened. No longer were hundreds of concubines imported from distant lands. No longer did favorites rise to control the court. The valid sultan still held influence, but her word carried less weight as bureaucrats, generals, and reformists took control of the empire's future. The harem's walls, once the fortress of female power, became a gilded cage of tradition. The corridors still echoed with music, prayers, and gossip, but the Game of Thrones had ended. Its queens had outlasted their era. Still, the legacy of the harem reached far beyond its marble gates. The women who once lived there, from nameless odalisques to legendary figures like Hurram Sultan and Qasim Sultan, reshaped the empire's destiny. They proved that power could wear perfume, that intelligence could thrive in captivity, and that politics could flow not only through swords and soldiers, but through letters, lobbyists, and whispered advice. Their descendants carried fragments of that legacy into the modern age, an unspoken memory of women who ruled unseen. When the Ottoman Empire finally crumbled in the early 20th century, the last harem women were quietly released, their titles dissolved, their silks replaced by simple garments. Some married, some vanished into anonymity, and others lived out their final days in melancholy dignity, watching a world they once ruled disappear forever. Yet history could not erase their shadows. The harem remains a symbol both of oppression and of cunning survival. It was a prison for many, a throne for a few, and a world where ambition, beauty, and danger coexisted behind the soft flutter of a curtain. Marco Polo was born in 1254 in the glittering city of Venice, a republic built on water, trade, and ambition. The air of the lagoon always carried the scent of spice, salt, and silk, reminders that Venice's fortune was tied to the distant east. His father, Niccolo Polo, and Uncle Maffeo were among the city's wealthiest merchants, their ships crossing the Mediterranean in search of rare gems and exotic goods. But Marco's childhood was marked not by luxury, but by absence. His father had departed on a trading mission years before his birth, vanishing into lands few Venetians had ever seen. By the time Marco was old enough to walk the docks and watch the galleys return, he had never met the man whose name he carried. He was raised instead by his extended family, learning the arts of commerce and navigation from a distance. Venice itself was a teacher, a city where maps were as valuable as gold, and every merchant's son was expected to speak in numbers and trade routes. Marco's education was rigorous. He learned Latin, Phoenician, and a little Greek. He studied currencies, weights, and the subtle art of negotiation. Yet his imagination wandered beyond ledgers and contracts. He listened to sailors' tales in the taverns, of deserts that burned under an unending sun, of cities made of gold, and of emperors who ruled from the edge of the world. In 1269, when Marco was 15, his father finally returned to Venice. He did not come alone. Alongside his brother, Maffo, he carried treasures and strange curiosities from the east, and a letter from none other than Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler of China. The brothers told of their first journey through Constantinople and Bukhara, of their audience with the great Khan, and of the Khan's invitation to return, this time bringing Christian scholars and sacred oil from Jerusalem. Marco listened in awe as they described lands beyond imagination. Persia, Samarkand, Kath, names that sounded like magic. When they prepared to return to fulfill the Khan's request, Marco refused to be left behind. At just 17, he left the marble canals of Venice for a road that stretched thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and empires. His departure marked not just a family reunion, but the beginning of a 24-year odyssey that would change how Europe saw the world forever. In 1271, Marco Polo set out from Venice with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffo, embarking on a journey that would span nearly a quarter of a century. Their destination was not simply a city, but the very heart of Asia, the court of Kublai Khan, ruler of the vast Mongol Empire. Their route would take them across the treacherous arteries of the Silk Roads, through lands where merchants vanished and kingdoms rose and fell overnight. The Polos were armed not with swords but with trade goods, wit, and the Khan's own golden passport, a tablet inscribed with the great Khan seal, granting them protection across his dominions. From Venice, they sailed to Acre, the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, where they obtained the oil from the lamp of the Holy Sephila, a sacred gift for the Mongol emperor. From there, they crossed into Armenia and the barren highlands of Persia. The deserts of Iran tested their endurance. Sandstorms choked the sky. Wells ran dry and the heat turned metal into fire, yet the Polos pressed on, guided by the promise of the East and the favor of fortune. They followed ancient caravan routes lined with ruins, remnants of cities destroyed by Genghis Khan's conquests. In Hormuz, they considered sailing to China, but the ships were too fragile for such a perilous voyage. Instead, they chose the overland route through the heart of Asia, a decision that would define their legend. The path ahead led them through the Pamir Mountains, where thin air and blinding snow reduced even the strongest men to exhaustion. Marco later wrote that in those high passes, the fire burned black and no birds flew, so great was the altitude. Beyond the mountains lay the endless sands of the Tiklamachan Desert, a place travelers called the Sea of Death. Winds howled across shifting dunes, and phantom voices were said to lure wanderers to their doom. The Polos survived only by following the stars and the footprints of their camels. Along the way, Marco's eyes opened to the vast diversity of the world. Persian astronomers, Turk nomads, Buddhist monks, and Muslim scholars. For a young Venetian merchant, the journey became more than trade. It was a passage into the unknown, the slow awakening of a European mind to the immensity of Asia. After months crossing Persia's deserts and caravan routes, the Polos reached the formidable Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world. Rising like frozen fortresses between modern-day Tajikistan and Afghanistan, the Pamir were unlike anything a European had ever seen. Jagged peaks clawed at the clouds and icy winds howled endlessly through the valleys. The air was so thin that even fire refused to burn properly, and travelers often fell ill from exhaustion or madness. For Marco, still in his teens, it was a brutal introduction to the sheer scale of Asia and the fragility of human endurance in its face. Caravans moved slowly through narrow passes laden with goods from far-off lands. Jade from cotton, silk from China, and spices from India. Snowstorms buried trails overnight, and avalanches could erase entire groups of travelers without a trace. The Polos learned to trust their guides, weathered men who could read the shifting moods of the mountains like scripture. At night, they camped under stars brighter than any in the Venetian sky. Marco later described the heavens above the Pamir as so near that one could imagine touching them. It was here that the young Venetian began keeping detailed notes of geography, customs, and landscapes. Observations that would later astonish Europe as they descended from the heights. The world changed again. The harsh silence of snow gave way to the windswept plains of Central Asia. They entered lands once ruled by Genghis Khan. Vast stretches dotted with Mongol jurs, felt tents, grazing herds, and campfires flickering like stars upon the earth. In Samarkand and Kashgar, Marco encountered the crossroads of civilizations, cities where Persian, Chinese, Indian, and Arab merchants bartered in a dozen languages. Mosques stood beside Buddhist shrines and caravans offered rest to travelers from every corner of the world. Here, Marco learned the rhythm of the Silk Road, days of hardship broken by nights of hospitality. He observed Mongol riders who could loose arrows while galloping at full speed, and Persian astronomers who charted the heavens with instruments unknown in Europe. The journey had ceased to be a mission of trade. It had become an education. The world was no longer a flat map to Marco. It was alive, vast, and infinitely layered. Every mile carried him further from Venice and closer to the heart of the Mongol Empire. After nearly 4 years on the road, the Polos finally reached Chengdu, better known to the West as Xanadu, the summer capital of Kublai Khan. For Marco, it was like stepping into a dream carved from golden jade. The palace shimmered with marble walls, gilded roofs, and gardens so vast they seemed endless. Streams ran between pavilions, and tame lions and leopards lounged beneath blossoming trees. The Khan's palace, Marco would later write, was the greatest and most magnificent that ever was. But what truly captivated him was not the wealth, it was the ruler himself. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, was unlike any monarch Marco had ever imagined. He ruled an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea, the largest the world had ever known. Yet he received the Polos not as conquerors might, but with the calm curiosity of a scholar. The great Khan had long been fascinated by Europe, and their arrival fulfilled a promise made years before. Niccolo and Maffeo had once assured him they would return with Christian emissaries. Though the priests they brought turned back in fear, the Khan welcomed the Polos with open arms, intrigued by their courage and their knowledge of trade, languages, and far-off Christendom. Marco, with his youthful charm and keen observation, quickly attracted the Khan's attention. The Mongol ruler recognized intelligence when he saw it, and soon began to test the young Venetian with questions about the West, its kings, its faiths, and its technologies. Impressed, Kublai appointed Marco as an emissary within his vast court. From that moment, Marco was no longer a mere traveler. He was a servant of the most powerful man on earth. Life at the Mongol court was a theater of splendor. Feasts stretched for days with musicians from Persia, jugglers from India, and dancers from China performing under lanterns that glowed like stars. Thousands of courtiers moved in silence at the Khn's command. But beneath the grandeur lay a sense of order, discipline, and intellect. The Khn encouraged learning, debate, and innovation. Marco found himself standing at the crossroads of civilizations, witnessing the fusion of East and West long before the world even knew they could meet. Marco Polo's life changed forever when Kublai Khan appointed him as an imperial envoy, a trusted messenger of the Mongol court. It was an extraordinary honor for a foreigner and one that carried immense responsibility. The Khn saw in Marco something rare, a quick mind, a sharp memory, and the calm courage of a born diplomat. Fluent in several languages and endlessly curious, Marco became the Khn's eyes and ears across the empire. His journeys would take him through lands that no European had ever seen. From the mountains of Tibet to the tropical kingdoms of India and Burma, the role of emissary demanded more than endurance. It required tact. Wherever Marco went, he carried the authority of Kublai's golden seal, a symbol that guaranteed him passage, food, and safety across the empire. He met governors, scholars, and generals, observing every detail of their cities, customs, and courts. In Yunnan, he marveled at elephants clad in armor. In Tibet, he encountered monks who lived in silence, surrounded by spinning prayer wheels. In Burma, he described golden pagodas that glittered under the blazing sun. Marco recorded everything, not just the splendor, but the logic behind it. The irrigation systems, the postal stations, the paper money, and the bureaucratic precision that made the Mongol Empire function like clockwork. He was not merely a spectator. He was a bridge between worlds. His Venetian background allowed him to understand trade, while his immersion in the Mongol court gave him insight into Asian governance. Marco grasped how the empire connected merchants from the Mediterranean to the Pacific through roads guarded by Mongol soldiers and rest stations stocked with supplies. It was a network of order and intelligence that Europe could scarcely imagine. Years passed as Marco moved from province to province, earning the trust of local rulers and the admiration of the Khn himself. Wherever he went, he adapted, eating local food, learning local etiquette, and even adopting the flowing robes of a Chinese nobleman. The Venetian merchant's son had become a citizen of the world. By the time he returned to Kublai's court, he was no longer a foreigner. He was part of the empire's fabric, his fate now inseparable from the destiny of the great Khn. During his years as emissary, Marco Polo came to know the heart of Kublai Khan's empire, China, or as he called it, Cath. What he found there defied everything Europe believed about the East. The cities were vast beyond imagination, the people disciplined and industrious, and the wealth seemingly endless. Roads paved with stone stretched farther than any Roman highway, while canals threaded the countryside like silver veins, carrying barges heavy with rice and silk. Nowhere, Marco later wrote, was there such order, such plenty, such splendor. For a Venetian accustomed to the narrow alleys of his lagoon city, China was another world. He spent years in the empire's northern capital, Kbalik, modern-day Beijing, where the Khn ruled from a palace that dwarfed the cathedrals of Europe. The walls were painted in vermilion, the roofs gilded in gold, and the throne room could hold thousands. Marco observed how the Mongol rulers had blended their nomadic traditions with the administrative genius of the Chinese. He witnessed the use of paper money, a concept that astonished him. Of no intrinsic worth, he wrote, yet accepted everywhere as gold. It was a civilization built on trust, innovation, and efficiency. Outside the capital, Marco traveled through fertile provinces where farmers tilled the land with iron plows and harvested silk from shimmering mulberry groves. He described porcelain production in Jingdejian, coal used for heating in northern China, and the empire's postal system, a network of horse relays so swift that messages could cross thousands of miles in days. There is nothing in Christendom to match it, he would later claim. But it wasn't only material wonders that fascinated him. He admired the philosophies that shaped Chinese life. Confucian order, Buddhist compassion, Taoist harmony. He saw how religion and governance intertwined not through force but through balance. It was to Marco a revelation, an empire that ruled not by chaos but by reason. For 17 years he lived among these marvels, recording the details with the precision of a scholar and the wonder of a traveler. He was no longer the witty-eyed youth from Venice. He had become the West's first true witness to the grandeur of the East, a chronicler of a world that Europe had yet to dream of. By the late 1280s, Marco Polo had spent nearly 2 decades in service to Kublai Khan. He had traveled across Asia, governed cities, and witnessed the full majesty of the Mongol Empire. Yet beneath the splendor of his life at court, a quiet longing grew, the desire to see Venice again. His father Niccolo and Uncle Mo shared that yearning. They had fulfilled their duty, served their emperor loyally, and aged far from home. But leaving the great Khan's court was no simple matter. The Khan had grown fond of Marco and regarded the Venetians as trusted advisors. He was reluctant to let them go, fearing they might fall into the hands of rival rulers or never return. Their chance came in 1291. A Mongol princess, Etienne, was to be sent westward to Persia to marry a prince of the Ilkhanate, another branch of Genghis Khan's descendants. The journey was perilous, and the Khan needed men he could trust to escort her safely. The Polos volunteered. After emotional farewells, Kublai reluctantly granted them permission to depart, providing them with a golden passport that guaranteed protection and supplies throughout the empire. The voyage home was long and grueling. The Polos joined a fleet of 14 ships that set sail from Zaytun, modern Quanzhou, the great Chinese port. Storms ravaged the seas and disease spread through the crew. By the time they reached Persia 2 years later, only a handful of the original travelers survived. The princess safely reached her destination, but the Polos, though successful, were weary and aged by hardship. From Persia, they continued westward overland through Trebizond and Constantinople, following once more the routes they had taken in youth. When they finally arrived in Venice in 1295, they were unrecognizable. Their faces were tanned by desert winds, their clothes foreign, their chests filled with treasures, jewels, silks, and gold-threaded garments. At first, their own relatives doubted their identity, until the brothers cut open the seams of their robes, spilling out rubies and sapphires as proof of their fortune. After 24 years, Marco Polo had returned, not just with wealth, but with a vision of a world far greater than Europe had ever imagined. Yet his greatest adventure, telling that story, was still to come. Peace did not greet Marco Polo upon his return. Venice was at war with its old rival Genoa, 2 merchant empires locked in a bitter struggle for control of Mediterranean trade. Marco, ever the patriot, outfitted a galley at his own expense and joined the fight. But fate had other plans. In 1298, during a naval clash near the coast of Dalmatia, his ship was captured. The man who had crossed Asia and dined with emperors now found himself chained in a Genoese prison cell. Yet it was there, not in the halls of Kublai Khan, that his true legacy would be born. Imprisonment did not break Marco's spirit. In his cell, he met a fellow inmate, Rusticel of Pisa, a writer of romantic tales and crusader legends. Rusticelo was captivated by Marco's stories of the East, of porcelain cities, golden palaces, and the great Khan's empire that stretched beyond imagination. Encouraged by his cellmate, Marco began to dictate everything he had seen and learned during his 24-year odyssey. Rusticelo wrote it all down in Old French, shaping it into a vivid narrative that would become Il Million. Known later as the Travels of Marco Polo, the book was unlike anything Europe had ever read. It described lands beyond Persia and India, kingdoms of unimaginable wealth, strange customs, and advanced technologies. Marco spoke of Japan, Chipangu, where roofs were covered in gold, and of the empire's efficient postal system, where couriers rode day and night to deliver messages across continents. He recounted black stones that burned like wood, coal, paper money that held more trust than gold, and cities larger and cleaner than any in Europe. Readers were both enthralled and skeptical. Some dismissed him as a liar. Others hailed him as a prophet of discovery. Yet his words ignited a spark of curiosity that would shape centuries to come. Long after his release and return to Venice, the travels spread across Europe, copied by hand and translated into many languages. It became the medieval world's first true window into Asia. While Marco may have lost his freedom in Genoa, he gained immortality. His prison cell became the birthplace of a legend, a story that turned one merchant's journey into the map of the world's imagination. When Marco Polo was finally released from prison in 1299, he returned to a Venice forever changed, and he too was no longer the same man who had left its lagoons 28 years earlier. Wealthy, wise, and worldly beyond imagination, he settled back into the life of a merchant, marrying and raising a family. But his fame had already begun to outgrow the narrow canals of his homeland. Copies of the travels of Marco Polo circulated across Europe, each retelling spreading the wonder of his discoveries further. Some readers hailed him as the messenger of the East. Others mocked him as Il-Million, the man of a million lies. Yet whether they believed him or not, his stories changed the Western mind forever. For centuries, Europe had viewed the East through myth and rumor. Lands of monsters, Prester John, and the Garden of Eden. Marco shattered those illusions. He described China not as a fantasy, but as a sophisticated civilization governed by law, wealth, and science. His accounts of paper money, coal, and road networks revealed an empire far ahead of medieval Europe. He mapped the Silk Roads and chronicled regions unknown to his contemporaries: Burma, Tibet, Sumatra, and even the court of the Mongol emperor. His writings were not merely a traveler's tales. They were the blueprint of a connected world. Scholars debated his accuracy. Skeptics doubted his memory, and explorers obsessed over his roots. Among them was Christopher Columbus, who carried a well-worn copy of the travels on his voyage to the New World 2 centuries later, convinced he could reach the lands Marco had described by sailing west. Through Columbus and those who followed, Marco's influence shaped the very age of discovery. When Marco Polo died in 1324 at the age of 70, he was asked on his deathbed if he would retract his stories. He reportedly replied, "I have not told half of what I saw." That sentence became the epitaph of his life, a testament to both his humility and his awe at the world's vastness. Marco Polo did not just travel farther than any European of his time. He expanded the boundaries of human imagination.